A decade ago, a man in his 30s by the name of Henry Rogers was one of 32,000 faculty members working in the State University system of New York. Henry was an assistant professor making a modest salary as he taught history classes to undergraduates. And wasn't exactly lighting the academic world on fire, but he was doing pretty well, all things considered. Henry had graduated from high school with a GPA below 3.0, SAT scores hovering around 1,000. And with numbers like that, many students decide to pass on college entirely for good reason. But here was Henry Rogers teaching college students. He wasn't simply going to college. He was educating the next generation. So he was something of an unexpected success story. Now, nevertheless, despite the many blessings that were bestowed on him by affirmative action, Henry Rogers dreamed bigger. You know, he didn't want to be stuck at SUNY forever. He knew that if he wanted to make a lot of money and advance in academia, he needed a rebrand. You could only go so far with a white-sounding name like Henry Rogers in the American university system these days, especially in a state like New York. So in 2013, Henry Rogers changed his name overnight. He became Ibram Kendi, or Ibram X Kendi for short. And from that point forward, anyone looking at the CV of this assistant professor at a middling state school wouldn't immediately think of someone boring and generic and pasty. Instead, they think of black revolutionaries like Malcolm X. Now, looking back, Henry Rogers' name change may go down as the single most effective rebrand in the history of this country. I mean, his timing couldn't have been better. At the moment, Henry Rogers transitioned into Ibram X Kendi. Corporate media in the U.S., it just so happened, was looking for something to cover besides wealth inequality and Occupy Wall Street. They decided, apparently in concert, to craft a narrative that innocent young black people were being hunted down by deranged white supremacists. To advance that narrative, the media lied about the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and eventually George Floyd and so on. And during this period, they needed talking heads with names like Ibram X Kendi to tell Americans that their real problem wasn't Citibank or JP Morgan, it was white people. One thing led to another, and before you knew it, Henry Rogers was on the move. He was hired by American University in Washington, D.C. in 2017, which at the time was struggling with the news that bananas had been spotted hanging from trees on campus. This was presumed to be a racist incident because why else would there be bananas? It must be racist. And Henry Rogers was going to fix things. He was going to fix everything. Specifically, Rogers promised to develop a racial reporting guidebook and to conduct a symposium on racial reporting. Now, none of that ever materialized, and this is a theme with Henry Rogers that promises things and they don't actually happen. But even so, Rogers received tens of thousands of dollars in grant money from places like the Ford Foundation and elsewhere to make it happen. But Rogers was not completely idle during this period. After 2 years at American University, Henry produced a now infamous book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which offered a novel theory. Henry argued that the solution to racism is more racism. Quote, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Now, if your IQ is higher than Henry Rogers, and unless you're a house cat, it almost certainly is, that might seem counterintuitive. In fact, it might seem like the single dumbest idea ever committed to paper. But in 2019, this theory, this explicit endorsement of racism, of discrimination, lit the academic world on fire. They were thrilled by it. That same year, Henry Rogers was invited to speak at the Aspen Ideas Festival, where he had the opportunity to expound on his ingenious thesis before an audience of adoring, mostly white sycophants. And yet, despite the friendly audience, things didn't go well. And not to oversell, but this may be the single most amusing clip to come out of the entire DEI anti-racism craze. And in case you missed it at the time, you're in for a treat. Here is Henry Rogers, aka Ibram X Kendi, explaining his definition of racism or lack thereof. Listen.
I'm wondering, I just finished reading Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, and I think she did like an excellent job of defining racism as like a system of oppression as opposed to like a personal choice. It's like, it's there, you benefit from it, or you don't. That's its purpose. You talked about the importance of defining racism, but I, unless I missed it, which is possible, I didn't hear your personal definition. Is there one that you would offer us? Like, how do you define racism?
Sure. So racism, I would define it as a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. Sure, a collection of racist policies that lead to racial inequity that are substantiated by racist ideas. And anti-racism is pretty simple, using the same terms. Anti-racism is a collection of anti-racist policies leading to racial, anybody want to take a guess? Equity that are substantiated by anti-racist ideas.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It's the most comprehensive talk I've seen on racism in my whole life. I really appreciate you.
That's because of Jamel.
Thank you for this. This is the best. That was the most insightful thing I've ever heard. That was the greatest wisdom that has ever been passed down in the history of mankind. Now, this is an amazing clip for many reasons. For one thing, even in the moment, with everyone in the room on Henry Rogers' side, there's still nervous laughter when he tries to articulate the definition of the central concept animating his entire life's work. Even by the standards of woke academics, this was bad. And they all knew it. Racism is when you're racist. Well, you know, racism is when racist things happen. Okay, thanks, Henry. That was very illuminating. Everyone just smiles and nods awkwardly because that's what academia is now. It's a grift. There's no integrity. There's no dialogue. There are no ideas at the Aspen Ideas Festival. There's just whatever that was. Now, this moment was not the end of Henry Rogers' academic career. Of course, it should have been. He's in the business of anti-racism and can't tell you what it is. There's a lot of that sort of thing going around on the left, if you haven't noticed. Criticizing Henry Rogers, though, or denying him promotions is white supremacy. So the promotions kept coming. Henry went on to spend a year as a fellow at Harvard University after that, and then he received yet another prestigious offer. Just weeks after George Floyd's overdose, Rogers was hired to lead Boston University's Center for Anti-Racist Research. And within weeks, massive donations were flowing in. Jack Dorsey, the weird bearded founder of Twitter at the time, donated $10 million to Rogers' new center. Lots of money coming from lots of people. Random companies like Vertex Pharmaceuticals contributed millions of dollars as well. In total, the center raised well over $40 million to combat racism. And it's going to be combated by a guy who can't even tell you what it is. So where was all this money going? According to Boston University, it was going to fund some really path-breaking original research in the field of anti-racism. In December of 2020, for example, BU published an article on its website promising that Kendi would be bringing anti-racist investigators together with data scientists to tackle racial inequities and to, quote, establish Boston University as the nation's leading academic institution for data-driven anti-racist research. You know, with profiling, surveillance, and data harvesting, there are lots of things not to like about tech giants, but what can you actually do about it when you rely on some of their many products? We don't all have $44 billion to go buying up Twitter and reform tech companies from the inside ourselves, but the good news is you don't need to be a billionaire to take a stand. For less than $7 per month, you can join me and fight back against big tech by using ExpressVPN. How do you think big tech companies make all their money anyway? Well, by tracking your searches, video history, and everything you click on, and then selling your personal data. ExpressVPN helps you anonymize much of your online presence by hiding your IP address, a unique identifier that every device has that allows big tech to match your activity back to you. That's why I use ExpressVPN on all my devices to make it much more difficult for them to exploit my data for their own purposes. And the best part is how easy it is to use the ExpressVPN app. I just have one button on my phone or computer to turn it on, and that's all it takes to keep people out of my business. So if you don't like big tech tracking you and selling your personal data for profit, it's time to fight back. Get ExpressVPN right now to protect your online freedom and privacy, and get 3 extra months for free by using my link at expressvpn.com/Matt Walsh Show. Well, what came of this unprecedented collaboration between Rogers' anti-racist experts and BU's data scientists? Were racial inequities tackled? Not quite. The Washington Free Beacon looked into this, and they found that Kendi's Anti-Racist Center established something called the Racial Data Lab, which is now completely defunct. Quote, as of September, the Racial Data Lab only compiled information on COVID-19 infections and deaths. The COVID-19 tracker stopped collecting information in March 2021. The center has since removed the names of anyone who worked on that project from its website. So they compiled information from a bunch of other sources about COVID deaths. And then they stopped after about a year. That's it. Now, we did reach out to Boston University to see if there was something we were missing, but they didn't reply. So it's clear that the sum total of BU's big anti-racism data initiative, the one they touted with articles and a lot of marketing materials, was this. This was it. This little COVID tracker. That's all they did. Now, to be fair, in its 3 years of existence, Rogers' anti-racist center also managed to take other steps towards anti-racism. For example, scholars at the center managed to produce not one, but two published papers in 3 years. 2 whole papers for $40 million. It's not bad. That's $20 million apiece. One of these papers looked at Google Street View images and concluded, based on that neighborhoods with mostly black residents have more dilapidated buildings than neighborhoods with mostly white residents. I mean, this is groundbreaking, shocking stuff. No one knew that until they spent millions of dollars studying that. And then someone, it's a light bulb moment. One of the researchers said, hey, get over here. Look at this. According to what I'm discovering, inner city communities have a lot of buildings that are in bad shape. Dear God. Now, for his part, Kendi had some bright ideas that he occasionally shared with media outlets in this country. For example, he told Politico, quote, to fix the original sin of racism, Americans should pass an anti-racist amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The amendment would make unconstitutional racial inequity over a certain threshold, as well as racist ideas by public officials. It would establish and permanently fund the Department of Anti-Racism, DOA, comprised of formally trained experts on racism and no political appointees. The DOA would be responsible for pre-clearing all local, state, and federal public policies to ensure that they won't yield racial inequity. So imagine spending millions of dollars investing in a research center written by someone who sincerely believes something like that is a good idea. I mean, it's so unbelievably degrading, so stupid that it defies analysis, really. What would you tell your shareholders? What would you tell yourself when you look at yourself in the mirror? Is there literally anyone on the planet who thinks a Department of Anti-Racism, literally the acronym is DOA, dead on arrival, would be a good idea? Well, maybe if you were one of Rogers' investors, you'd hold out hope that sooner or later the scholars in this prestigious anti-racism center are eventually going to buckle down and get to work and produce something that's actually useful. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. And that's now very clear. This week we learned that Kendi's anti-racist center has just fired more than half of its staff. They've apparently managed to burn through much of the $40 million they've raised. And to be clear, this is an operation that does not involve particle colliders or expensive equipment. Okay, this is a bunch of anti-racist experts sitting around telling white people that they're terrible. And whatever else you want to say about work like that, you would think at least it would be cheap. But they managed to blow through $40 million in 3 years doing that. And now at long last, Boston University says that it's opened an inquiry into where all this money went exactly. If we're being honest, federal prosecutors should also be doing an inquiry about that same subject. But of course, we know that they won't because Henry Rogers is doing their bidding. Now, at this point, it would be easy to gloat, gloating over the aftermath of the complete and total implosion of this whole project. And we should gloat a little bit because it's hilarious and everyone who got screwed out of their money deserved it. There's the fact that one of Rogers' former staffers called these layoffs an example of employment violence and systemic racism, which is pretty funny. Many observers have made the point that the woke inevitably eat their own, and that's true for the most part. You get a bunch of professional whiners into one room, get a bunch of professional victims into one room, give them $40 million, and pretty soon they're going to be out of money and still complaining. In case that's not obvious, Henry Rogers just proved that point. So what's going on here? Why did his anti-racist center really collapse? Was it just mismanagement? Is this an isolated incident confined to Boston University? That's possible, but if you look at broader trends, it seems like something else is afoot here. It seems like all over the country, major institutions are ditching the DEI scammers. It's not just happening in Boston. According to one recent analysis, job postings for DEI positions fell by roughly 20% last year. The average tenure of senior DEI executives at Fortune 500 companies hired since 2018 has been less than 2 years. That's according to a consulting firm that specializes in this area. BLM, meanwhile, is in the red as of last fiscal year. They're bleeding cash. They're burning through cash. And a lot of it they wasted on mansions in California, apparently. So seeing all of this, it's tempting to say that the whole anti-racism scam is collapsing. But as welcoming a development as that would be, I think we have to resist the temptation to come to that conclusion. I don't think that's exactly what's happening here. As we've all learned over the past 10 years, the race hustle is far too useful and far too profitable to the people in power. And multiple generations of Americans have been too thoroughly indoctrinated into this. Millions of black Americans really do believe that they are perpetual victims, while millions of whites really do see themselves as guilty of imaginary racial sins. Just because Henry Rogers and a lot of his imitators have been exposed doesn't mean that the underlying ideology has been defeated. These charlatans are low-hanging fruit. They're grunts that are easily replaceable. And, eventually they're all going to self-immolate because they're a bunch of cheap con artists, and that's what cheap con artists do. But still, you have to think about how quickly these grifters took control of every major cultural and political institution. We went from don't judge people based on the color of their skin to discrimination is anti-racist in a very short period of time. Feels like it happened overnight. Okay, like the Protestant Reformation took a lot longer to get going, if only because people were communicating by horse or shipborne letters or whatever. The woke social credit equity biosurveillance state, that Reformation took hold much faster. And they can elevate con artists like Henry Rogers so quickly that we don't know what's happening until they've got $40 million in control of major institutions. They can scam the most sophisticated investors on the planet, allegedly, from tech executives to big pharma. Henry Rogers and his team, they haven't done much in their tenure as highly paid anti-racist activists, but they have demonstrated one thing, albeit inadvertently. And that's the fact that there isn't any substance to so-called anti-racist ideology. It's just mega corporations looking to give big payouts to the first guy they find with an exotic name. If it's not fraud, it's something very close to it. If the right can finally admit that, instead of playing along with these charlatans and funding the universities that promote this garbage, then things can change very quickly. But if we can't take those steps, then nothing will change at all. If we continue to tolerate this, then no matter what happens to Henry Rogers, we can look forward to many more Ibram X Kendis down the line. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.